Okay, so my name is Jeff Howe. I'm a faculty member in the Taiwan Studies program at the University of Washington, Seattle. And it's my honor to serve as the host of the program today. The Taiwan Studies program at UW was established in 2017 with a mission to promote research and education on Taiwan society and culture. In today's program, we would like to bring attention to a growing area of activities in Taiwan and the rest of the world, the emerging practice of digital governance and its impact on the public sphere during and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. With the format of this event as a small example, the current pandemic has propelled transformation in how communication and deliberation take place, how information gets disseminated and also curated, and how decision-making is facilitated. Historically, in liberal democracies, these activities constitute what we know as the public sphere. Now, as the public sphere becomes increasingly the domain of digital governance, what has changed and what has not? What will be the impact on democracy and social life as we know it? To help us tackle these questions, we are joined today by the person who is most knowledgeable about the topic, Taiwan's Digital Minister, Audrey Tang. Welcome to the program, Minister Tang.
Hi, good local time, everyone.
Great. And we're also joined today by two experts in the area of public space and urban design. First, Kevin Xu, who is a Senior Assistant Director at the Center for Liveable Cities, Singapore, and also formerly a researcher at the UIA Digital Planning Lab, as well as a lecturer in the D School at Stanford University.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you.
Next, Hendrik Tieben, who is Associate Professor and Director of the MSc in Urban Design program at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's also one of the initiators for the 2020 The Year Without Public Space webinar series that set the stage for today's event. Professor Tieben. Welcome to the program. Okay, so now let's begin. The year 2020 is almost at the end, and we are now more than 9 months into the pandemic, at least according to WHO. What has been the role of digital governance, including open data, civic tech, and so forth, in addressing the COVID-19 crisis? And in what area has it been the most effective, or perhaps not? So perhaps we can start with Mr. Tang.
Okay, I think digital is the most effective when it plays a assistive role, as in assistive technology, assistive intelligence. I always emphasize the most important is the physical vaccine, the mask, the chemical technology that's hand sanitizers, including soap and alcohol sprays, and then maybe digital technology. And so if the digital technology is there to assist people to remember to wear a mask, to protect ourselves from our own unwashed hand, then that works very well because it enhances the agency of each individual. If on the other hand, digital technology is built to replace the role of human contact tracers, then it doesn't work that well. And so this is just to set a stage. Now, how would digital technology actually help to remind people to wear a mask to protect their own against their own hands? Well, we have this cute analog dog called Zongchai, the Shiba Inu, the official spokesdog of the social media campaign of the Central Epidemic Command Center. So when I tell you to wear a mask to protect against your own hands, you may remember, but you probably will not share the message that easily. But when the very cute dog tells you not doing this, like literally not putting your fingers in your mouth or something, you will probably not only remember, but actually because it is so cute, you will probably share it. And the same goes to, for example, the physical distancing rules. When you're indoor, keep 3 of those cute Shiba Inus away. And when you're outdoor, keep 2 of those away from each other. And so this is communication designed to be remixed, to be kind of mimetic, to be like a vaccine of the mind, because you probably cannot unsee this after seeing the cute dog. And so you will probably not believe the conspiracy theories concerning physical distancing or masks, because you've already laughed about it. And this is the digital communication strategy that we call here humor over rumor. And that is the beginning of my response. But I'd like to hear from others too.
So we're talking about these kind of everyday digital technologies, in addition to the one that may be more advanced than most people.
Yeah, the daily communication, basically. So there's a technology, I'm not sure even if it's digital, it's called TV broadcasting every 2 p.m. So every 2 p.m., the Central Epidemic Command Center does this broadcasting for more than 100 days during the pandemic. And people actually just tune in every 2 p.m., kind of listening to it like a podcast or something. And so the Quint, the 5 medical officers, just provides a very to-the-point response to all the questions that all the journalists ask. And so based on the press freedom in Taiwan, sometimes they have to field very interesting questions, but always the commander Chen Shizhong works with a kind of humility, saying, oh, that's a really good question. Oh, why don't you teach us? Or things like that, like working with the journalists instead of against the journalists. And also enables another, I'm not sure whether it's digital or not, technology called a toll-free number and a call center. Okay, I guess this is digital. And so anyone who calls 1922, the hotline, can actually get their kind of slowly repeated version of the 2 p.m. press conference. If you happen to miss it, or if you don't understand some of the details, you're free to call 1922, and someone from the call center will patiently explain to you. But some people call it to complain. For example, back in April, there's a young boy who called to complain, saying, we're rationing our mask, and all he got was pink medical mask. And he doesn't want to wear pink to school because pink is for girls, and people will laugh at him. And so what to do? And the call center people doesn't know how to answer that. And so it got escalated to the CECC. Now, the very next day, all the medical officers wore pink medical mask, regardless of their gender. And so, in a sense, the gender mainstreaming becomes the most cool thing. And I think the commander, Chen Shizhong, the minister, even said Pink Panther was his childhood hero or something. And so, for a while, we all have those pink medical masks. And exactly, you see that there too. So the popular brands actually colored their social media avatars pink. As well, and that massively increased the likelihood of people wearing the mask, not just for safety, protecting against their own hand, but also to make a statement. So this, the rainbow part, will also be quite popular when we had a Pride parade and things like that. And so this all increased the basic transmission rate of science and clarifications and ideas that's worth spreading.
Yeah, that's great. It really gave us a sense of what is really on the ground in Taiwan. So perhaps, Director Xu, do you want to respond to this question?
Sure. So Singapore has also been quite proactive in using digital tools to support the efforts of our multi-ministry task force on COVID-19. In the early days, working very rapidly to move from concept to product, the GovTech agency put together a Bluetooth-based protocol called BlueTrace. And in Singapore, a Trace Together app using this protocol can be downloaded onto a smartphone, which allows health authorities to know which other Trace Together users have been encountered by the phone's user. But one thing to note is that all the close contacts are actually stored on your own device and not sent to the government. So only when a person is found to be coronavirus positive and then uploads the data, only then does the government have access. And GovTech actually made this protocol open source so that other governments interested in utilizing it, as well as advocates who might be concerned about privacy, could actually peer into its workings and be reassured about its capabilities. So that was one example of kind of a use of a digital technology. But I think some other very practical ones as well. So Singapore, we actually implemented a circuit breaker from April to June, when essentially people were asked to stay at home and not come out very much. And during this time, however, people still needed to access essential services, such as buying food from supermarkets or going outside for exercise. And the Urban Redevelopment Authority, that's our planning and conservation authority, our digital planning lab actually developed a web-based resource called Space Out. And it allowed the public to actually see real-time and historical crowd levels of different premises, such as malls or markets or post offices. And then they could actually choose where and when to go to purchase things or to access those services. And the National Parks Board also used drones and human counters to track how crowded parks were to make that information available online, so residents could also go out to safely exercise. So it was really putting that type of information at people's fingertips, and I think, as the minister mentioned earlier, kind of giving people the ability to make that right choice.
Professor Tieben, do you want to respond?
Well, for me, first of all, I had the opportunity to stay the first 5 months of the pandemic in Taipei, because I was at that time there. Basically came over Chinese New Year and got stuck in a way there, and then worked then online. And so I firsthand I could see those the impact of all those ideas, and I was very impressed. So I missed that particular period in Hong Kong where I'm working. I think, of course, in Hong Kong, I would say compared to many other parts of the world, maybe because Hong Kong and Taiwan went through SARS, that in general, I think in international context, it is relatively okay, right? In terms of digital tools, there were very early already those kind of maps where you could see exactly where an outbreak would be. I think what was a little bit different to the Taipei version or Taiwan version was that I think in Taiwan was never revealed any kind of personal information. Here, it was relatively easy potentially to spot exactly which unit it is, right? So that might be good for safety reasons, but also create potentially anxiety. We have recently the system with QR codes, but it's not a must to check into those, right? But I think that the most important parts in Hong Kong were probably more the reaction of the civil society, because many people just went through SARS and were just kind of so panicked and or not panicked, but so aware and scared, and really immediately started to wear masks and try to be careful. And I think if the numbers are low, I think it's very much linked to this, right? And then otherwise, I think in terms of digital device, of course, what kept probably many places alive is also digital food supply and so on, right? Of restaurants and so on, even though we can go to restaurants. But I think that's another level that many places have, but also here started very early, I think, yeah.
Great. So moving on quickly to our next topic, the public sphere has long been a critical component of liberal democracy. Free exchanges of ideas, for example, are important in shaping public discourses that in turn hold the government accountable. How do you see digital technology and governance reshaping the public sphere? The formation of public opinions, the public discourses, the system of representative democracy, and so forth, beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. Perhaps Professor Tieben can start for us.
Yeah, well, I think that we saw overall that the pandemic basically didn't bring like entirely new things, but it's basically more created earlier tendencies gained much more momentum and were boosted. And so we have all kind of, let's say, online communication, online education, online shopping already existed before, but they were just kind of boosted to a scale that was never there before. And they affected maybe the use of physical public space, but not necessarily so much the public sphere. Then on the other hand, we saw that there's an increased use of digital tools for surveillance, right? And also restrictions in some countries of press freedom. It's kind of interesting. I recently read this fantastic book by John Barry, the great influencer in 1919, right? and you could see basically almost everything that we are talking about now, the restriction of press freedoms, fake news, and so on, or were already there at that time more in the United States and in Europe, and today we see it here in some places in Asia. And they might kind of erode the political culture, right? The other thing is, I believe, as we have seen also, or a reason to have this event, right, that we have new digital tools, obviously, that also create new opportunities, right, for digital governance, or new forms of exchange of ideas, like the initiative that we had. It's kind of a very small one, but where all of a sudden it's possible to link with people in 6 continents and discuss about experiences and so on, and it's almost for free, right? Those kind of things didn't exist before. So I think we see those kind of different tendencies, I would say.
Great. Perhaps Mr. Tang, you have a lot of experience setting up, platforms for these kind of, public deliberation. Does this spill over into the larger public sphere, or what are some of the lessons that you have come across?
Yeah, definitely. I think one very good case study before the pandemic was the Airbox initiative. In Taiwan, there's a lot of people who are concerned about PM 2.5, which probably cannot be intuitively felt, but people do feel the effect of PM 2.5 in air pollution. Instead of waiting for the government to do anything, people just bonded together and installed those very low cost, like less than $100 airboxes, usually actually in primary schools, as the teachers teach data competence, digital competence, data stewardship, and things like that. It's actually much easier to teach if the students are in a data producer role rather than just a data consumer role. And all across Taiwan, you see thousands of those airboxes and sharing their data of real-time PM 2.5 measurements to a distributed ledger. And also the Academia Sinica, the National Academy, supports the algorithm that calibrates those airboxes and so on. And so this is accountability, right? This is the citizens giving an account of what a pollution level is like to each other. But it started by the social sector, by the people. And then they will pressure the public sector, saying that, hey, we see those missing points here, what happens there? Well, it turns out these are industrial parks, and the primary school teacher probably cannot break and enter industrial parks to install those airboxes to complete the map. But because they already gain so much legitimacy vis-a-vis the public sector, so the EPA has to work with them instead of against them. And then we set up this civil IoT system, and then we started installing those air pollution measurement devices also on the lamps in the industrial parks, because it turns out the municipalities own those lamps. And so this is the people-public-private partnership. It's the social sector setting the norm, the public sector completing the norm, and the business sector working with the norm. And this has been the case also of the PPE supply. So starting early February, pretty much the same mapping technology has been used to track the availability of masks in pharmacies. And people who queue in line can see with their own chatbots or things like that, or voice assistants and so on, the real-time inventory. So when I see someone queuing before me, swipe their national health card and get 10 masks, then I know that they purchased 10 masks because it's refreshed at most every 3 minutes. So actually it was 30 seconds, every 30 seconds in the beginning. And so because of that, people who queue in line are engaged in participatory accountability. They don't have to blindly trust the National Health Insurance about the numbers, which would be the case if we publish daily. But just like airboxes, this published every minute or so that ensures people who queue in line can keep each other in check. If they see somebody swipe their card, but rather the inventory increases, they will call 1922 right there. So that is part of the public sphere, but built by the social sector.
That's great. So we're really talking about sort of governance from the bottom, right? So we often think about governance as this kind of top-down process. This is really sort of distributed, governance from the bottom. So, Director Xu, what do you think?
Well, I thought it was really great when the minister was sharing about this idea of citizen science, and it was really neat to kind of see the connection between kind of online with offline projects or offline presence. And I think that exchange of ideas and education, bringing people up to speed and training them on how to use these tools, that's a really good use of digital technologies. It really reminds me of some of these open online courses that we put together at Stanford, and really tried. I think the potential, of course, was there to educate people about certain topics, right? Whether it's math or computer science. But the ones that I found really exciting were the ones that these courses might have had a social mission or a public interest goal. And it was really a great way of kind of adding to the public discourse about these topics and then making sure everyone is equipped to kind of have a conversation about them. And in those kind of settings, I think for these open online courses, right, sometimes called massive open online courses or MOOCs, I think what was really important is not just the course content itself, but also the ability to actually build communities, so convene people and then bring them together into conversation and let them have the tools for having a meaningful and positive exchange. I will say that doesn't always happen naturally, and so kind of thinking through what are the ways you actually have a positive kind of community building experience is quite important. And I think recently in the US, we've actually seen kind of an uncontrolled situation, right? Where it was very prevalent during like the COVID-19 pandemic and the election season. You get basically false posts on social media. And essentially there had some people claiming the pandemic's not real. You had a lot of fake news that's distributed online that contributes to a coarsening of public discourse. And I think in this whole digital realm, it'd be great if corporations, they essentially can influence or amplify certain types of speech. For instance, by recommending videos that might claim like the Earth is flat, for example, right? So we've heard of those types of algorithms, and it's really done through algorithms sometimes, not always through explicit editorializing. And so if these algorithms are basically tuned toward user engagement or mind share or monetization or provoking certain types of behaviors, then they really have to be administered very responsibly. And that's why kind of in the citizen science case or in a classroom setting where it's a little bit more, it's not as Wild West, you have a chance to really craft the type of engagement and craft the experience that the students or the participants are able to enjoy. And I think that's like a really powerful use of the tool.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so speaking of citizen science and education, obviously some communities might be better equipped or prepared to be engaged with that. So I think one of the most critical lessons of the pandemic has been the impact of disparity between different people with different socioeconomic standings. So, for example, people at the bottom of the social ladder, tend to be in worse, situation under specific housing conditions or inability to work from home or lack of healthcare. And so how can digital technology or digital governance address this disparity? And does it aggravate it through the digital divide? And how can such divide be overcome? So perhaps, Director Xu, can you continue with your thoughts?
Sure. Okay. Well, digital tools certainly can help us diagnose challenges and give it a spatial dimension and then work to solve it. I think one interesting thing is like in the United States, they've been tracking ethnicity related to coronavirus cases alongside other important demographic information. And that let us know that some minority communities, such as Black, Latino, or Indigenous communities in some states are actually being harder hit. I'd say like when we think about disparity, even with the advent of new technological solutions, maybe not everyone has access to the same technology or is not digitally literate in the same way. Older people, for example, may or may not know how to download and use a smartphone app. So in Singapore, the government's actually manufacturing and distributing physical tokens, which use that same Blue Trace protocol I mentioned earlier. And they're much easier, these physical tokens, for senior citizens to just carry around. I think if we kind of return to the realm of urban planning and the use of digital technologies and disparity, and especially if we're thinking about this new normal that will come after the pandemic, it'd be great to use digital tools to actually assess equity and evaluate if all residents are doing well under a certain planning scenario, or if there might be communities that are underserved. Especially, I think not everyone's going to experience public space the same way. And we understand through the pandemic how important having access to public space is. And so that same demographic information, things like age, ethnicity, linguistic group or native language, physical ability, I think all of those things are important to understand, because what's good for like the average person that the planner looks at may not actually end up serving all members of the community, because people do have distinct needs. And so I think I'll just close with a point that it's really important that we actually make amenities accessible, walkable, and reachable for all. And in the US, we actually have had studies that show some minorities have less access to green space, for example, in cities. And so if we know this, we can try to amplify voices that aren't usually heard in the planning process and make sure everyone's needs are met.
Mm-hmm. Right. Minister Tang, what has been your experience in terms of addressing issues of disparity?
Yeah, in Taiwan, of course, we have broadband as a human right. So anywhere in Taiwan, no matter how remote, even on top of Taiwan, there's Savia or Pedaguneng or Yushan or Jade Mountain, many names, because we're a transcultural country with 20 national languages. Anyway, so even on the top of Taiwan, you're guaranteed to have 10 megabits per second at just $16 per month for unlimited data. Otherwise, it's my fault. Like personally, we've had people like complain, like who literally wrote emails saying, it took me 4 attempts to send this email. I'm in the quarantine place near the Yangmingshan, and in this particular site near the mountain, I don't have telecom reception. I have to go to the other end. You promised broadband as a human right. And so 2 weeks after that, we installed a new telecom tower. So anyway, the point is that we're really committed to broadband as a human right. And this is the basis on which to build, for example, the universal healthcare system, the single-payer health system, that then made it actually more accessible for people to get a mask from a local pharmacy, to go to a local clinic for a diagnosis. If they develop something like COVID symptoms, it's actually cheaper than drive-through testing. And you can't say that in pretty much anywhere else in the world. And that made actually the support very grassroots, so that the local pharmacists who are trusted by the elderly people doesn't know how to work with a mobile app. That's okay. They just take their physical token, that's a national health card, which is an IC card, to the pharmacy. And with the same experience as getting a refillable prescription, they can get not only the mask, but also pretty good advice from the pharmacies. We had a choice earlier on to start deploying mask rationing based on mobile payments or real name easy cards in convenience stores. But we consciously chose the pharmacies because it will empower the people who are closest to the pain, who are elderly, who don't know how to use mobile payment and things like that. And also because it increases the trustworthiness of the pharmacist system. And so I often say that the national health insurance is a social democracy. We're a social democracy when it comes to health and learning. We're a liberal democracy otherwise. But it is actually very important that those pharmacies do have fiber optic connection, more than 90% of them, like lightning fast to the National Health Insurance Agency, which enable the mask rationing to go without congesting people, like long lines and things like that due to the lack of broadband access. So this is the most important thing, to be assistive in helping the helpers in the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you wrote somewhere about bring technology to people rather than bring people to technology.
Yeah, rather than forcing people to technology. Indeed.
Right. Yeah, this is a great example. Professor Tieben, what do you think?
Well, I think that the point of the pharmacies is quite interesting, and I remember a common friend of us, Ying-fen, was writing about or thinking about how important in Taiwan the relationship between the very high density of pharmacies in the first place is, and might have also contributed to the success of the mask system and so on, right? Because that in itself is already a kind of amazing infrastructure, right? That then you can build on top of that, right?
Exactly.
In Hong Kong, I think that well, in general, the number of infections and so on were relatively low, but I think as it was also in New York or in other places, the question of health disparities is, of course, quite important. No? And for example, we were studying with NGOs together the situation of people in the subdivided flats, for example, units which are very famous for Hong Kong, right? Where people just live on a less than the space of a parking lot, or maybe half a parking lot, right? And I think that in general, the access to internet, most people have some form of an internet access, but there were under the pandemic some kind of shortcomings. One was that libraries were one of the places that were one of the first places closed, right? And many, particularly living in this kind of very crowded conditions, particularly kids would usually go there to study for the exams and so on, right? So those spaces all of a sudden wouldn't be there together with the universities and so on, with the need then for the kids then to stay the whole time home in this kind of very confined situations. Of course, they can walk around in the city, but because also, for example, that's then where if they have internet, where they would have internet, and then under these conditions, all in one room, and then two kids maybe parallel having online class. I mean, then also you need to have really a good internet and so on. So in the detail, there are a lot of kind of issues that are very much related to this kind of very dense living conditions and access to affordable housing and so on that were brought even more stronger to the foreground, right?
Okay, so next we talk about the bottom-up governance and the phenomenon of that in Taiwan and elsewhere, but we still have a government, and in most part of Asia, the culture of civic engagement is still emerging. There is a strong kind of resistance from the state democracy, state bureaucracy towards civic engagement on issues such as urban planning, which is often entangled with urban politics. So how can digital governance help address issues like these? Minister Tan, have you had any experience with applying digital tools to urban planning?
Yeah, quite a few, actually. We run every year the presidential hackathon, which is for the social sector to work with public servants and the business sector on those 3 months prototypes projects. And it's for the people to vote through a new voting system called quadratic voting, the importance of those sustainable development goals. So each project needs to correspond to one or more SDGs. And which project ends up making the cut is determined by quadratic voting. So this system ensures that there's broad support for the project that actually gets the coaching, for the trilingual, like trisectoral, cross-sectoral coaching for the competition. And the 5 winners every year of the hackathon, they don't receive any money as a prize. Rather, they receive a trophy, which is the shape of Taiwan, with a micro projector that, when turned on, projects Dr. Tsai Ing-wen, our president, handing the trophy to you. So it's a self-describing trophy. And that represents the presidential promise that whatever you did for the past 3 months, we will make it happen either locally or on a national scale in the next 12 months. And this is very important because there's many good social innovations that just needed this sort of presidential commitment that makes this kind of planning happen. So for this year alone, there's, I think, 3 urban planning related winners out of the 5 champions. There's one called Patch by Planting that use AR tools on the phone and also on tablets and so on to look at unused lands that's owned by the state or one of the state's subsidiaries and plan what will happen if we plant trees there. And so this is really a great tool for people to envision a scenario together and commit to taking care to the trees and for the trees to talk back. Well, not like the movie Avatar, but to kind of share the kind of health indicators of the trees so that the local government do not have to assume all the maintenance cost of working with the gardening, but the local people can join as well. And they, thanks to winning the presidential hackathon, is already working on the ground around with the Taoyuan City Municipality Council on that. And there's also one called Circuit Plus that use, again, a map. There's something about maps in Taiwanese civic tech. A map of nearby drinking water places like water fountains and so on, but also local businesses that want to provide water for free. And we call it Feng Cha, or tea serving, referring to this ancient Taiwanese tradition of offering free water to the passersby. And so people who want to refill their bottles can just use this app, like a Pokemon Go, to go to the nearby station, to check it in, to rate on the flavor or warmth of the water served there, to connect to each other, to earn some coins, to redeem the coins, to win some mission and go on a local tour and things like that. And all the while just making it a habit of refilling their bottles rather than buying new plastic. And the same app has been connected to another champion of this year, which will then send you push notification to engage more with the local drinking places when there's excess heat, to not suffer from heat damage and things like that. So this is essentially a placemaking tool, but masquerading as something like Pokemon Go, a game, and that will enable more community engagement and things like that. So that's 3 out of the 5 champions. I just briefly describe, please feel free to check out at the Presidential Hackathon website.
Great. It's great you mentioned Patch by Planning. I actually know the team that's behind the project. It is an amazing project.
Awesome.
So Tieben, you're probably the most experienced on this question. What has been your experience?
You mean in terms of the digital one, or the other public spaces that are still physical? Because yes, in terms of the digital, I believe Minister Tang is much more experienced in this field. But I would say that we see now, of course, also with our students and so on, more and more kind of working on making kind of apps for public spaces and so on. But I think it's still kind of a longer way to go, and we see in general still some kind of fatigue, either fatigue in terms of public participation, because people feel like there's maybe it takes too long time until they really see kind of positive outcome from those points, or also don't trust maybe that it's really making a big change. We see, on the other hand, much more people kind of working with kind of using games and so on in the process of public engagement and so on. But I think many of them are not only digital but also physical, right? But I think that I see there a kind of big trend now in architecture schools or in colleges and so on to work with that, and which is kind of encouraging. And we just need to see like how these things become kind of implemented and so on, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think you mentioned civic engagements in your question, and I think for something like that, digital tools are definitely helpful, though maybe might not be a panacea. So they can like augment civic engagement in terms of, for instance, if you have very user-centered platforms and services, you can try to collect citizen feedback or sentiments, and then try to use these to support participatory planning. I actually think the minister has worked on some really interesting stuff, so would actually love to kind of hear more about that from the minister. But I think when we talk about engagements, the URA, the Urban Redevelopment Authority in Singapore, for example, has increasingly tried to experiment with some different modes of engagement in order to incorporate more grassroots voices or make planning itself more participatory. I think the National Parks Board has also used participatory methods to identify features for new parks they're designing. I think out of all these exercises, the real key is transforming our understanding of what engagement is, because it's not a pro forma exercise, right? It's really, we should see it as something that can help us better understand a problem and better understand human needs, and then craft solutions that respond to them. And I think really take a lot of inspiration from what you might call design thinking or human-centered design, where we really try to understand the users before developing solutions. And so it's not, engagement isn't just, here's my solution, now I go out and engage, right? It's actually trying to understand the user in the first place. And that type of engagement and understanding really helps us uncover what the real problem we're grappling with is, even before we start generating new ideas and solutions.
Okay. So Mr. Tang mentioned this project, Patch by Planting, and so there is a kind of a digital platform as a medium, but ultimately trees still need to be planted, right? So the actual space is still there, and so we have talked quite a bit about the digital dimensions already. What about the continuing significance of actual physical space? Space of assembly, gathering. The hackathons still take place in actual physical space, right? I just actually attended the Golf Zero meeting in Taiwan recently. It's a wonderful gathering. So what is the future of public space in the age of technology and social media? Maybe Professor Tieben, you can you're the expert on this. What do you?
Well, I think that if we can frame it like, let's say, for example, is there another public space after for the new normal, right? And for that, I would say the experience of, I would say, Taiwan and Hong Kong show that we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel, that we need to have spaces for social distancing, right? Because wearing this and kind of being kind of responsible and so on, right? And we don't have a lockdown, right? In Hong Kong, is no real lockdown, and Taiwan wasn't a lockdown, right? So I think in terms of the if public space need to be fundamentally different, I'm not sure, because still it is important for people to come together, right? But what we see is, I think that investment into certain kind of projects, I think on one hand, certain kind of green book kind of systems, networks that allow kind of alternative forms of traveling through cities, right, can be very successful, right, because they really provide places, breathing spaces, but also kind of to calm down and so on. So when I was in Taipei, I used extensively these areas of the kind of artificial wetlands and so on, and you could see everyone is, and then of course you can very easily get a bike and bike around and so on. I think these spaces obviously help a lot in those kind of problematic moments, right? So Hong Kong has this in some parts. Where I live, I'm lucky where my university is, it works actually very well. And these were planned in the 1970s, interestingly. But today, not necessarily would be implemented new in other areas. No? So I think this is very valuable. And the other thing is, of course, again, this question of health disparity and so on, to see, like, particularly in the worst neighborhoods, how we can help them, because usually that's also where then not those kind of spaces are provided and so on, right? And where people live so crowded, for example, here, that the need is much higher, right? Maybe I leave it with that for the moment. Sorry.
Okay. Perhaps Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll still be very useful to have physical public spaces. I think people want to meet. I think when William White was studying New York, right, his seminal kind of research on public spaces in New York, what really attracted people to places was the presence of other people. I think what we're seeing, though, in pandemic times is when you want to be outside, you might actually want to be spaced away from others. So you still need public space that can accommodate that. And then also, we kind of talked a little bit earlier about having public space to exercising. And that really means that the quality of public space matters. You can't just have like a small pocket park near your house and then check off the list and say, oh, this neighborhood has access to public space, right? Because that space needs to be sufficient to actually accommodate the type of activities people want to take on. Right? So it needs to be kind of broadly available to everybody, and then also of sufficient quality so people can actually do the activities that are important to them, whether it's during a pandemic or perhaps after. So I think really for urban designers in the future, when they're designing these public spaces, it's just going to have to be a lot more flexible, so they can be useful both for pandemic times when people want to space out and find solitude, or sometimes you might even have to convert it into like a field hospital or quarantine site, and then non-pandemic times when people actually want to gather together and be social. So being able to accommodate.
Minister Tang, so what do you think the interface between public space and digital governance?
Yeah, I'll just share with you my office, like literally my office. If the people who help the show can help putting on the presentation that I just shared, you will see literally my office. And here, yes. So this is the Social Innovation Lab, literally at the heart of Taipei City. And this place is drawn, the public art is drawn by people with Down syndrome, with trisomy differences. And so while, of course, I look at the world and see, I guess, UML diagrams or category theory arrows or, I don't know, raining numbers, the people with Down syndrome see the world like Van Gogh, like with connected geometries and topology. And so by making sure that the space is open to everyone, we literally tore down the walls because this used to be Air Force headquarters. So anyone can walk in and engage in social innovation work. And I'm here like every Wednesday from 10 a.m. to the evening. So anyone can book 40 minutes of my time to talk about social innovation matters. And so this is actually a connected space. So this connects to like 5 other social innovation labs across the country, so that when we tour around Ireland, for example, I will go on the social innovation tours, and I will meet people, like empower people who are farthest away from Taipei City, and then just meet them at their regular town hall, sometimes with cultural interpreters, if it's indigenous. And then in the social innovation lab, 12 ministries gather, and just in a kind of immersive co-creation experience, just listen to the people who share about their locality. And this is important because too often people in the central government just read the descriptions of the issues brought up by the local people, so they can fix that and solve those problems in the abstract, but actually create more problems for people on the ground. But if they can listen to the whole story, and instead of sending, PowerPoints or Word documents, actually we're more into open documents around, then actually they can co-create with the local people, and the local people will feel that they're much more close to other connected spaces. So a physical space like this is important to inspire people to think outside of the box, to hack existing policies, if you will. Talk about hacking. There was a visitor to the space, a pirate, really, the mayor of Prague, Hendrik of Pirate Party, and this is his small cabinet, and they get so inspired that they climb on those grids that are not designed for climbing, and while holding the Sustainable Development Goals cards, and took a picture together. I was smiling kind of nervously because we've never tested that, and so I was afraid they may fall, but they did not. And so this is how inspired people get just by virtue of showing up in the co-creation space, and we can connect many of these together. Then we feel closer to each other than ever before.
That's great. So now we know where to find Minister Tang on Wednesdays.
That's right. Always in the Social Innovation Lab.
Right. Okay. So you kind of gave away my next question. We have talked quite a bit about governance already, but for those who know my own work, which is focused on bottom-up urbanism, I'm actually more interested in the notion of hacking. So Mr. Tang is a current, perhaps former civic hacker. What can the government or governance learn from the community of civic hackers? And what are some of the lessons of civic hacking for the public sphere?
Yeah, I want to pick up on the earlier note of design thinking, because in design thinking, it's kind of the digital tools are great to help us discover more and also more effectively define common values. That's what the digital technologies really assist us. But on the development and the delivery, of course, that takes time and also space. And so this is like the usual view of things. But I think hacking is very interesting because it kind of reverses the time, like in the movie Tenet. So you can go with a system that's already in development, but then you think repurposing it in a different way. And then you think in a backward notion to redefine and rediscover what a system might also be good for. So in a sense, the Gov0 movement, G0V.TW, which you actually participate in one of our hackathons, is just about looking at all the digital services in Taiwan by the government, which is something that Gov.TW, and change a O to a 0. And then you get into the kind of shadow government, like join the Gov.TW, become join the G0V.TW, which is always more fun and engaging and so on. And people go on a journey of redefining together and rediscovering together. But it's always into the commons, because we always use Creative Commons and open source and free software to work on those alternate visions. And so when those alternate visions, it could be budget visualization, it could be a transcultural dictionary, it could be many other things. If the government likes it, well, they can just merge. So forking is with an aim to be eventually merged. And I think this makes this diamond like a pincer movement, if you have watched the movie, so that we can all work together in both directions.
That's great. So we're really talking about, you mentioned the term shadow government. We're really talking about people creating the government on their own terms.
Mm-hmm. That's right, exactly. Like self-empowering the governance, which is why Gov0 people usually talk about governance instead of government, because it's a pluralistic take on governance.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So maybe Kevin, I don't know if you do any hacking on the side, where you're a closet hacker. What are your thoughts?
So I guess I can focus on kind of a physical analog to this, kind of in the realm of placemaking, which we could call tactical urbanism. And I definitely, there is a role for bottom-up participation in the planning of cities and the making and shaping of cities. I think especially we need this because a population may be quite diverse, and you want to give people agency to shape their neighborhoods. And so globally, there's a lot of interest in placemaking, and in particular, kind of one way that this is accomplished is through tactical urbanism, where people actually make small interventions in their neighborhood. And if it's worked, it then might become formalized by the city. And so some cities are welcoming this trend of experimenting, and it's a physical experiment, right? It's not necessarily a digital one, but there is kind of physical making, and then these prototypes that go out on the street. And San Francisco even has like a prototyping festival where artists and designers are able to try out prototypes with the public, with the sanction of the city for a few days during the year. And then, Professor Ho actually has a good book on some of this placemaking and kind of guerrilla urbanism that folks may want to check out. I think one last point about this is that for cities broadly, then the critical question is, how do we activate the public to participate in these types of experiments? And I think it can be really helpful as too, if we're thinking about post-pandemic, can people be part of rebuilding after it, right? So what kind of role can they take in revitalizing neighborhoods, revitalizing the economy? And I really think that participatory placemaking is a great way to channel that energy for the public benefits. And then if you are hoping to do something that is participatory, you do have to remember as a city that part of this is about accessibility. How do you make processes open and more welcoming to folks? It is about, in part, using more open source tools. So perhaps a broader range of people can participate, and explicitly inviting people, sharing data, sharing knowledge. So people aren't starting from zero.
Right. Professor Tieben, you have actually done quite a few placemaking projects with your students at Chinese U. What's your take on hacking?
Well, I would, of course, we can say that maybe some of those kind of placemaking projects are maybe, if we use Kevin's way of kind of saying that tactical urbanism is a bit kind of linked to it, then I think that many things that people have tried out also in Hong Kong, and we were part of that in a way, might have made kind of steps in this direction. I think the most important thing is then, of course, at some point, and this maybe also with this the different governance pages, right? How they merge, right? And I think for us, what was very interesting when we traveled last year with our students to study this New York City Public Plaza program, which was one of the programs or projects that was launched by Bloomberg, who also created Hudson Yards, and maybe one of the most exclusive projects in New York. But on the other hand, that particular program, I think the Plaza program was quite interesting, because it basically encouraged communities to propose projects and then help them, basically the transport department that then would actually roll out and build those things, but with the community input, of course, famously from community organizers from the Queen's Museum in Corona Plaza and so on. And then we went back to those places only online now during the pandemic, because we couldn't travel, but we looked at it during the pandemic together with Miodrag Mitrosinovic, our partner in Parsons in New York. And what we found out that during the pandemic, those places that were really created in some of the most impoverished maybe neighborhoods, also with the most cases of COVID, but that in those places, those community public spaces that were co-created, they had an important role, not necessarily being used as public space, but because of the community networks that they created. And these would also then become the help networks under the pandemic, right? Which was very interesting to see, and very encouraging that this is an interesting way to bring this together. Vis-a-vis, for example, projects like, of course, the High Line, that is kind of beautiful and so on, and started as a citizen project, but also changed a little bit, and was one of the first projects that was closed, right? And cost millions of dollars and so on. While those kind of mix of hack and government, right? They seem to be quite valuable in these moments. One question I would have maybe for Minister Tang is like, now when you are, because now you are on the other side, right? Did you have situations that your work was hacked in a way that made you uncomfortable and so on? Because of course,
definitely.
Very good.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, and not in a good way. I mean, when we first decided to roll out an open API for the real-time mask inventory in all pharmacies, I mean, this is because I believe in open API, and our procurement rule is written so that vendor system integrators cannot discriminate against robots, so they have to offer an API in addition to a human interface. So this is all well and good. And that enabled then two social innovations, two hacks, if you will. One is the visualization, the real-time map, which is good, I guess, because it helps people to find a pharmacy that still have masks. But one is by the pharmacists themselves, who invented and both happened on February 6th. The pharmacists invented take a number system, because they don't want to process linearly the national health cards. So many pharmacies started to offer those small numbers plates, so that people who queue in line just trade in their national health cards to those numbers. Maybe they started saying, you know, we start getting the queue from 7 a.m. and all the way to 8 a.m. and then we hand out all those numbers. But they tell those people to go back in 7 p.m. or something to collect the masks while they process their health cards during the lunch break, as to not interfere with their drug dispensing business, because they still have a drug dispensing business going on. So this is great social innovation. It saves them time, everybody time. This is great social innovation. It saves everybody time. But taken together, they clash, because from the mask maps viewpoint, this pharmacy have completely availability, except during lunch, where it drops to 0. And so the map become not useful at all in the pharmacies that have introduced take a number system. So the two hacks cancel each other out and makes the trustworthiness kind of a net loss for everyone who practiced both in the first time. And so I even had a nearby pharmacy who paint using this A4 papers, 1 character per paper, so really large letters, that was saying, "Don't trust the app!" exclamation mark, with the exclamation mark on its own A4 paper. And so, of course, it was very frustrating. Like, people were hacking in 2 different ways, and they were opposing each other, kind of. But fortunately, one of the Civic Tech people, the name is Hendrik, who is the second person to make their map based on OpenStreetMap. The first one is called Howard Wu. Hendrik's map has a form for the pharmacists to file in their feedback information. So there's a lot of frustration, a lot of ad hominem attacks and so on. But when I browse through them all and suffer through them all, I see one really good nugget of idea saying, hey, why don't the map display 2 time slots? 1 for getting the numbers and 1 for getting the masks. And of course, I'm like Eureka, and thank you, random pharmacists, because it was anonymous. So we implemented right away, the very next week, the 2 data points so that they can announce they're open from 7 to 8 for the numbers, and then 7 to 8 in the PM for the masks. And so that puts some end to this canceling out. But on the other hand, if they hand out all the numbers by, say, 7:30, then that's still 30 minutes of time that they're on the map with inaccurate numbers. So one of the pharmacists told me, Minister, why don't you just put a button here that says disappear from the map? So as soon as I run out of those numbers, I'll just click this button, and then nobody will call me. And actually, that's a brilliant idea. And so by amplifying this on-the-ground social innovation, we empower people who are literally closer to the front line, the queuing lines. And once we implement that idea, they stop canceling each other, and then started to get pharmacies into a much more cozy place. And that in all took 3 weeks. And so, of course, I'm very fortunate to kind of survive through it. But the frustration, I guess, is turned into the spirit of co-creation after all.
Right. So co-creation and open source is getting this right. All right. So at this point, we're going to transition to a Q&A. So one question: what specific ethical frameworks do you use for digital governance? And in this, one person mentioned this example in Korea, where credit cards, transactions, and security cameras are now being used to conduct contact tracing. How do countries in Asia use digital governance differently? What has been the experience in Taiwan to protect personal data? So perhaps Minister Tang can start with that.
Sure. It's not so much a framework rather than a heuristic. During the pandemic, we simply say the government should not set up new data collection endpoints that was not there before the pandemic period. And this has its reason because we've never declared a state of emergency. So we're still operating under constitutional law system instead of this, ad hoc forgiveness by the parliament. We have to seek permission from the parliament for each and every work that we do because we never declare a state of emergency. And so we can only work with the cybersecurity and privacy parameters, the data collection points that was already there before the pandemic. So for example, handing out those tokens, the Trace Together tokens in Singapore has been considered, but never deployed in Taiwan, partly because we never had a community spread, but partly because that would constitute a new data collection point. So we had to work with, for example, the pharmacists, which are already handing out their refillable prescriptions based on the national health card. So the collection point is already there. It's just a new way to apply this data, right? And also during the digital quarantine, instead of working on Bluetooth or GPS or Wi-Fi based, more precise location systems, we basically made use of the cell phone tower signal strength, which is already used, although it was very coarse parameter, like 50-meter radius resolution. It's already used for advanced earthquake warnings people who don't receive those warnings even say that they're kind of nationally forgotten border people or something. But nowadays people do receive those earthquake warnings quite well in advance, like seconds before the actual earthquake hits. And there's also the flood evacuation warnings and things like that. So people understand this will not read your application level message. This will not interfere with your GPS. You can receive the earthquake warnings even with the GPS and Bluetooth and Wi-Fi all turned off. And so basically, this is an existing data collection point, the signal strength that's already well understood by the citizenry. And so we have to make do with whatever we have based on this heuristic. Otherwise, we will have to pass new laws and new approvals by the parliament, which could be a much more lengthy process.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, Kevin, have you come across any ethical questions or issues in Singapore or elsewhere?
I think probably if you're talking about how we think about using digital tools or algorithms, I think that is something that we can think about, and especially thinking through like what maybe the limitations of digital tools are. One thing that's is that it's important to have like perhaps more transparency around algorithms, like when they're used, and then also how they're actually being encoded instead of just letting them be black boxes. I think sometimes they can be a bit mysterious. And I guess the minister mentioned kind of a heuristic. And I guess the idea too is that these tools aren't separate from human beings. And so it's really helpful to have human beings who understand and know when to apply the right tools at the right times. And for instance, there may be times when machine learning methods actually are quite useful, but we also should understand bias. I think a computer science department recently was found to have been using algorithms to rank PhD candidates instead of really having the full set of readers, human readers for the applications. And I think some critics were a bit, well, they were rightly concerned that this could potentially perpetuate biases by the software developers who actually coded those algorithms, right? So I think just kind of thinking through some of these issues can be helpful. Another kind of thing that, oftentimes we sell algorithms as, oh, it can be very time saving. And that's definitely true, but it can also like obscure what we're really aiming to reach for when we rely on a digital method. And I think essentially you have to make sure that the system actually is accounting for the things you truly value. And so from a planning perspective, for example, like actually being on the ground, engaging with the community, understanding their needs, hopes, and aspirations, like there's not many good substitutes for that. It's a very important and fundamental part of planning, but it takes time and it requires being thoughtful, right? And so, it just might require more time to be spent on that. I think my last point on this is just that we just want to be careful not to over rely on optimization methods because they're helpful as guides, but I think that's the key. They're guides, they're not prescriptions. And so there's still room for human beings to be planners, especially when we're trying to understand communities or balance different choices or make trade-offs. And I would say that the best tools actually empower planners to spend more time pondering over the right questions.
Mm-hmm. Great. We have quite a few questions on this issue of inclusivity. And this, somebody mentioned, that the group that could be characterized as digitally excluded. So the question was, how can public engagement on digital platforms be truly inclusive in terms of age, social, economic spectrum of the public? Anyone? Perhaps we can always start with Minister Tang.
Okay, so the answer is very carefully. So, in Taiwan, for example, our 5G spectrum, we designed the auction algorithm, the mechanism, really, really carefully, so that we make sure that the telecoms do pay for the actual values that they will create through those 5G spectrums. As a result of that, we have a lot more money than the original minimum price when getting the 5G spectrum. And then we earmark those price, the spectrum auction price, to the expense of basically subsidizing the work on not only communication, but also health and education in the most rural and unconnected places. So much so that we would say, 越偏乡越先进, the more remote you are, the more advanced you become. And this is important because then those purpose-driven businesses will be attracted to the places that actually need it the most, where the broadband application and, for example, using drones to deliver pharmacy prescriptions is not a nice to have. It's actually must have, because they have to spend maybe 2 hours or more on public transportation to a nearby pharmacy and so on. And so basically, this way of designing with intentionality, using market design and mechanism design to make sure that these are the public commons, the social common capital that everybody agrees on. Those 3 areas, we're a social democracy. Everything else, we're a liberal democracy, but these are social democracy. This then creates a market to, for example, the startups that want to prove their merits of service without necessarily a business model in a competitive marketplace in the municipalities, but they can prove the social impact first and become a purpose-driven business, or social entrepreneurship, as we call it here. And I think having a robust social entrepreneurship landscape and social investment landscape then encourages a more like sustainable capital and patient capital to enroll into markets, so the state doesn't have to subsidize everything, but the state need to take the lead on those issues like health and education and communication, where it is actually the state's responsibility to be a social democracy.
Okay, Professor Tieben, you have done quite a bit of work in community engagement. Are there things that we can, that the digital governance realm can learn from community engaged design to make the process more inclusive?
Well, I think that in Hong Kong, I think that the most important point is maybe that we have programs also for social innovation, and we have a lot of on the grassroots level and NGO level. I think a lot of very interesting initiatives, and but not necessarily only using digital tools, but also maybe also using conventional tools. But just to see like how can they be kind of scaled up or really affect the mainstream, right? Because if we see our kind of very strong kind of wealth gap and the very high Gini factor in Hong Kong and so on, right? That it seems kind of difficult to make a kind of very critical change of this kind of the bigger framework, right? So I think I think there are a lot of kind of innovations that are happening on this kind of more smaller level, also sometimes through government programs or universities and other or private initiatives, right? But then basically then it's almost like kind of a disconnect then to bring this into other parts, which is maybe not, it's a bit easy to say that everything in the system is like this, because if you look at the housing system in Hong Kong, public housing, for example, is sometimes even on a very high level from its quality to a certain extent, right? And is creating a certain kind of inclusion, maybe or at least like providing something of public benefit. But there are many levels where there is this kind of disconnect, and it would need a kind of better way to basically create the link from those ones into the kind of larger impact systems, right? And which maybe is kind of interesting that what happened with this kind of the two different the shadow websites and so on. So something like this doesn't really exist here, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, what do you think? How can we make the platforms more inclusive?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think for the creators especially, it's useful to remember that you're not only programming for yourself or people who are like you. So how do you really think about the broad spectrum of users and what their needs are? Accessibility, I think, is incredibly important. One helpful way of doing that is to work directly with those minority communities themselves to make sure that, for instance, an app works for people who are visually impaired. Another kind of really important feature to keep note of, especially if you live in a multilingual society, is that perhaps English or perhaps Mandarin may not necessarily be people's first language. And so how do you make sure that whatever resource you're offering is actually available to people from different linguistic backgrounds? That way it'll really be accessible, especially if you're trying to reach those populations.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let me see. So the next question is, how can digital governance fend against threats to democracy? Over the last few days, we have heard about hacking from Russian in the United States, and then this is not the first time it has happened. And there are other form of threats, the softer side in terms of just things that are happening through social media and so forth. So what can we do to fend against these kind of threats? Mr. Tang, how about you?
Sure. Because I understand we only have like 12 minutes left, I can't tackle cybersecurity and disinformation, so I have to make choices. Since it's more like a placemaking and digital governance, I think infodemic is more pressing and also less technical. So I'll focus on infodemic. Our counter-infodemic playbook, which is counter-infodemic with no takedowns, is markedly different from other playbooks around the world. And I think this comes from this simple heuristic. Just like people above 30 years old remember the lockdown of the Heping Hospital. And so we fight a pandemic and with just very simple heuristic, never go to lockdown because we know how bad it could be to the society. People who are 40 years old or older remember the martial law and the takedowns and the censorship and the lack of freedom on all fronts. And so people don't want to go back, not even a little bit there. And so we have to fight a infodemic with no administrative takedown power, basically. And so that basically means that we have to make sure that the vaccines of the mind race against the disinformation and win. And this is very difficult, actually, because unless you can detect the exponential disinformation before it actually goes exponential, you need kind of like advanced warning system. Because if you counter all the disinformation, there's no enough fact checkers or comedians or spokesdocs around. And if we focus only on the ones that have a R value above 1, then there's sufficient resource. But how do we know the R value of which misinformation will trend and become disinformation? So we also rely on crowdsourcing. In Taiwan, there's a broad system called COFACTS, which is also a GovZero project. So GovZero is in everything. So the COFACTS system basically makes sure that anyone can share with a simple long press, a long click, on their end-to-end encrypted channels. So like WhatsApp, but here it's called Line, to the fact checkers. And it's crowdsourced, so anyone may join. So just like flagging your email as spam, this shows to Line dashboards what kind of misinformation is now trending to on the verge of becoming disinformation. And so the COFACTS system, which is also adapted in Thailand. So instead of COFACTS.org, which is in Taiwan, they removed the S. And so if you go to COFACT.org, you see the Thai version of the COFACTS system. So I put it on the StreamYard. And so just by long pressing and sharing, we actually gained a kind of advanced warning of what disinformation will actually be trending 2 hours from now or so. And then we're given 2 hours to work. The fact checkers, the social sector people, the journalists have 2 hours to fact check that. The government, on the other hand, the competent ministries have 2 hours to work with comedians to produce memes that are hilarious and funny and make sure that the emotions goes from outrage to worrying, but then to joy because it's humorous. So this is a co-creational spirit instead of from outrage to fear and then to disgust, which is the antisocial part of the antisocial media. And so this is a race against time. It's hit and miss at times. But I think by and large, we have now worked a system out so that we can counter most of the trending or would-be trending disinformation within 2 hours' time into pictures, sometimes with very cute dogs and less than 200 characters.
That's great. Anyone else want to add?
It's kind of inspiring to see this, right? But of course, it's a question like, if you see it in larger scale, like for example, we look at American election at the moment, all those kind of things, right? It's you wonder how on such larger scales those things can function, right? Because it might not be possible to react so fast, and also because the audience is already so split, right? Because I think that also has a lot to do with the question of a fundamental, a kind of first trust in the government, right? That maybe I think was quite luckily quite positive. I think when the pandemic started to hit in Taiwan, that at the beginning it was also not so clear if people would trust or not, but then also with the kind of TV response that you mentioned and so on, that helped a lot, right? But I think sometimes if you have political leadership that is, for example, not supporting that or undermining that, as we have seen with particular politicians in big countries, then of course it's very, very difficult, right? Would you have any kind of suggestions what one can do in this kind of more, you lived very long time in the US also, in such kind of context, how could you approach that?
Well, if GovTech isn't helping, then Civic Tech takes over. I mean, that's why we occupy the parliament. So I'm not saying that you should occupy your parliament. I'm definitely not saying that. But that is essentially the grassroots response, right? So for the places where the top-down state flat out didn't function well, actually we had that, for example, back around the turn of the century, when we're still at the very beginning of democratization on the first term of Dr. Li Denghui, of the direct elected president in 1996, with a really huge earthquake, right? The September 21st earthquake. And that's, I think, the event that connected the NPOs and charities and NGOs and co-ops and placemakers into the so-called social sector. There was no social sector before the earthquake to speak of on the national scale. There was a lot of local scale, of course, placemaking activities, but the earthquake really brought the social sector national because they fill in where the government cannot. They fill in where the government did wrong. They filled in when the government kind of abused its asymmetry in governing and things like that. And that made the social sector much more legitimate. I mean, even now, more than 20 years later, when there's a large earthquake and one of the charities involved in the original September 21st earthquake published number, people still believe the charities number, the social sector number, more than the municipal number. That is true.
Yes, and that has been the experience in elsewhere in Japan and even in China as well. The power of the social sector, especially in situations after disasters. You mentioned Occupy. We'll use this as a last question. So the question is like this: in the United States, there's a stigma about around the world anarchists. What does the word anarchist means to you, Minister Tang, as a government minister? How do you draw upon your anarchist principle in your work?
Yeah, I used to simply say I'm a Taoist, but then the people in the US seem to think that I don't know, practice Qigong or do some spiritual rituals like the folk Taoist religion, which is great. I respect that, but that's not what I meant by saying that I'm a Taoist person. So then I came upon this idea of calling myself a conservative anarchist, which is kind of just the philosophical Taoism, but expressed in Western terms. Conservative in a sense that in the more than 20 national languages in Taiwan, each representing one or more tradition, I don't for a day want to make progress on one of those cultures to the expense of the other cultures, which is what used to happen during the martial law days too much, right? And so the idea is to be cross-cultural. And I even called 中华民国 the official name of the state. I translated it as the Transcultural Republic of Citizens. To highlight the idea of transculturalism and the conservative part. Now, the anarchism is very simple. I don't give orders and I don't take orders. I join the government to work with the government, not for the government, to work with the people, not for the people. And this is by voluntary association, radical transparency, location independence, forming the principle of the digital governance. But these principles I didn't invent on my own because these are the core internet governance principles.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's a great note to end on. It's been a wonderful 1.5 hours. I've personally learned a tremendous amount about digital governance and civic engagement. We talk about, governance from the bottom. We talk about pharmacies, the everyday spaces, and your idea about bringing technology to the people. I think that's one great example, and people becoming the government themselves. So these are some the greatest lessons, I think, for me, I'm sure for a lot of people. So thank you. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I would like to first thank our speakers for joining us this evening in Taipei, especially Minister Tang, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule, and also to both Professor Tieben and Kevin Su for joining us from Hong Kong and Singapore. I would also like to thank all of you watching in front of the screen right now, as well as our staff, Ying-fen Chen and Jennifer Joy from the UW Taiwan Studies program, who have been working behind the screen. And we hope to see you again at another UW Taiwan Studies event in the future. So thank you and good night from Taipei.
Live long and prosper.
Yeah.